What if logic itself could lie to us? What if the very system we use to uncover truth was wired to keep some truths forever hidden? Here's a quiet, disturbing thought to fall asleep with tonight. There are questions no logic can answer, proofs that collapse on themselves, sentences that undo meaning. Some riddles don't reveal truth, they protect it, and the more we try to solve them, the deeper we fall into their loop. If this kind of paradoxical calm fascinates, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We post every single day, so there's always something waiting for you each night. And tell us, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? We're genuinely curious. Now let the night begin with a whisper. Imagine a room lit only by a flickering candle. A stack of old papers rustles softly in the corner. One of them holds a statement, only one. It says, "This sentence is false." That's it. 6 syllables. And yet, it breaks logic. If it's true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it's true. It loops forever. This isn't a clever trick. It's a philosophical virus, a glitch in reason itself, and it isn't alone. There are hundreds like it, puzzles that are unsolvable, not because they're difficult, but because they are built to be unsolvable. They sit quietly at the edge of language, whispering, "There are things logic cannot know." The ancient Greeks sensed this early. The philosopher Eubulides, a student of Aristotle, was said to have first posed that liar's paradox over 2,000 years ago. He used it not as a joke, but as a weapon against certainty. For Eubulides, it wasn't about tricks. It was about showing that even the most careful system collapses under the weight of self-reference. It's like holding a mirror to another mirror. Meaning folds in on itself. And if one tiny sentence can break the rules of logic, what else can? That question stayed quiet for centuries, until a man named Gödel wrote something so terrifyingly brilliant, it shook the very foundations of mathematics. It was 1931. Gödel was just 25 years old, quiet, fragile, sickly, but his mind, sharp enough to cut through the steel framework of formal logic itself. He wanted to answer a simple question. Could mathematics prove all truths using only logic? At the time, many believed it could. The mathematician David Hilbert had famously declared that in mathematics there is no ignorabimus, no we shall not know. But Gödel didn't agree. He sat in the shadows and wrote a proof so paradoxical, it proved that not all truths can be proved. His paper, now known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem, was a dagger into the heart of mathematical certainty. Here's what it said, gently simplified. In any consistent formal system complex enough to describe arithmetic, there are statements that are true, but cannot be proven within the system. The system must be incomplete, always, every system, forever. Truth, Gödel showed, was bigger than proof. There are truths out there, perfect, silent truths that we can never touch. The moment a system becomes complete, it collapses. Just like the liar's paradox, just like the candlelit sentence on the wall. So what does this mean? It means that logic has limits, that even the cleanest equations, the purest proofs, hide invisible boundaries. And if we cross them, we fall into loops, infinite regressions, sentences that eat themselves. It's not just a math problem, it's a human one. Because language, for the very tool we use to think, is built on these same rules, and it inherits the same limits. Ever tried to define a word, using other words, that also need defining? It spirals. No matter how hard we try, some meanings remain trapped behind glass. We circle around them, we approximate, but we can't pin them down. Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most haunted philosophers of the 20th century, wrestled with this in his Tractatus. He argued that the structure of language mirrors the structure of reality, and that beyond language lies silence. Whereof one cannot speak, he wrote, thereof one must be silent. He wasn't being poetic, he meant it. Some things cannot be said, not because we lack the words, but because the words themselves break under pressure. Try saying something utterly true about the whole system from inside the system. It collapses, just like Gödel showed, just like Eubulides before him, and just like the most hypnotic trap of all, self-reference, the snake that eats its tail. The thought that thinks about itself, consciousness too, plays this game. Try to observe the self that is doing the observing. Try to catch your own mind in the act of being. It slips, it doubles, it multiplies. Philosopher Douglas Hofstadter called this strange loops. He said our minds are recursive, self-referring systems looping through abstraction. The I that thinks is a hallucination built by thought. The self is a paradox, and it gets stranger, because paradoxes aren't just quirks, they're warnings. Warnings that our thinking has hit a wall. They whisper, you are inside something, and you cannot see the outside. That's the real secret. These puzzles, these impossible sentences and logical traps, they don't just expose flaws in math or language, they expose flaws in perception, in human nature, in our hunger for certainty. We want things to make sense. We want truth to be whole, clean, permanent. But truth, it turns out, is sometimes silent, hidden, or worse, unknowable. So tonight, as the candle flickers low and the quiet deepens, consider this. The most powerful truths may be the ones that cannot be said. Not because we haven't found them, but because they live outside the very frame we think inside. They are not lost, they are forbidden. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's what makes meaning possible at all. After all, if everything could be solved, explained and proven, what would wonder be for? Gödel's discovery wasn't just a quiet revolution in mathematics. It was a mirror held up to the human mind. A whisper that said, not everything can be explained, even with perfect logic. And once that whisper is heard, it's impossible to unhear. It seeps into language, into philosophy, into every attempt we make to grasp reality with thought. The idea that some truths are unprovable is more than unsettling. It's poetic, tragic, liberating, because it means our understanding of the world will always be stitched together with gaps, patches of silence. Every belief, every theory, every map of meaning we draw will contain blank spaces. But here's the strange thing. We still keep drawing. We build entire belief systems on language. We give power to rules, to categories, to names. But language is slippery. Words seem solid, but they move. They change. They bend back on themselves. Ask anyone who's ever tried to explain love, or consciousness, or the feeling of déjà vu. Words reach, but they don't always land. And sometimes they don't mean what we think they do. Take the word nothing. What is it? A void, an absence, a space without content? The moment we try to describe it, we fill it. We give it properties. We make nothing into something. This is the trap. The deeper you chase clarity, the more you realize how language obscures as much as it reveals. And philosophers have known this for centuries. The Zen masters of ancient China and Japan used paradox as a path to enlightenment. Koans, they were called. Not riddles to be solved, but walls to be crashed into. A monk asks, what is the sound of one hand clapping? The mind grasps. It fails, it struggles to apply logic, and logic breaks. That's the point. The goal is not to answer, but to feel the limits of thought, to notice the craving for resolution, and then to let it go. Because enlightenment, they believed, begins when the mind surrenders its need to win. But even outside the temple walls, paradox has been used to disturb comfort. Zeno, the ancient Greek philosopher, gave us another set of puzzles meant to fracture our sense of certainty. Like Achilles and the tortoise, Achilles is fast, the tortoise slow. But if the tortoise is given a small head start, Zeno argued, Achilles can never overtake him. Because by the time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise began, the tortoise has moved a little further, and so on, forever. Each time Achilles gains ground, the tortoise slips ahead, infinitely close, never caught. Of course, in the real world, Achilles would pass the tortoise, but Zeno wasn't describing motion. He was revealing how flawed our concepts of time and space become when chopped into infinite pieces. He was showing that even something as obvious as movement can dissolve under logic. And that's the quiet terror of paradox. It doesn't just question answers, it questions the questions. It's not asking, how do we solve this? It's asking, what makes us think it should be solvable? That's what Gödel did. That's what Wittgenstein did. That's what the Zen masters did, sitting for hours staring at blank walls, waiting for the illusion of logic to collapse into silence. But silence isn't emptiness. In philosophy, silence often contains the most dangerous truths, the truths we don't know how to hold, or how to speak. And this silence, this unprovable, unspeakable void, doesn't just haunt logic and language, it haunts us. Because humans are meaning machines, pattern seekers, story builders. We crave certainty the way lungs crave air. And paradox is the anti-certainty. It's the quiet voice that says, you don't know, and you never will. That thought can be unbearable, but it can also be freeing. Because if not everything can be known, then not everything needs to be. The burden of total understanding is lifted. And what remains is curiosity, play, wonder. That's why paradoxes are not errors. They're invitations. They ask us to step beyond the edges of the map, to wander in spaces where language fails and logic folds in on itself. And the deeper we go, the more we realize that many of our strongest beliefs are built on assumptions we've never examined. Take self-identity. The word I who is speaking when the mind says I think. Descartes believed the statement, I think therefore I am, was the foundation of all knowledge. But critics have since pointed out that even this sentence assumes too much. What is the I? What is thinking? And if the self is just a process, a loop, then who is doing the thinking? Neuroscience now shows that decisions arise in the brain before we're consciously aware of them. So where is the self in that? Maybe the I is just the echo of a decision already made. Maybe free will is a feeling, not a fact. And, if that's true, then the self becomes just another paradox. A narrator invented by the story. A loop that believes it's a line. This is why Douglas Hofstadter called the self a strange loop. Because the mind is both the observer and the observed. The painter and the painting. The software and the screen. And the moment we try to look too closely, it flickers, it vanishes, it hides. That's not a flaw. That's what makes it beautiful, and human, and infinitely strange. Because in every attempt to understand the world, we are also trying to understand ourselves. And what we find again and again is that the deeper we look, the less clear things become. The questions don't end, they multiply. And each one whispers, language is not enough, logic is not enough. But maybe that's the point. Maybe meaning isn't found in answers, but in the spaces between them. There's a trick the mind plays without even knowing it. It begins when a question is asked, any question, and the brain tries to answer. But it doesn't pause to ask something more important. Is this question even real? Is it built right? Because sometimes a question is a trap shaped like curiosity. What colour is Thursday? Can a barber shave himself if he only shaves those who don't shave themselves? If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? These aren't riddles, they're weapons against reason, and like all good weapons, they disarm slowly, first with confusion, then with obsession, then sometimes with silence. Philosophers call these category errors, questions that mix incompatible concepts, asking the wrong kind of thing about the wrong kind of thing. But the brain doesn't know that. It's hardwired to seek resolution, and when it can't find one, it loops. That's where paradoxes live. In the space between the question and the inability to answer. Language is filled with them, built on them even. Words like truth, being, and nothingness seem clear until we try to define them. Then they crumble, because to define something is to divide it, to break it into parts, But some ideas aren't parts, they're wholes, and slicing them only destroys what they are. That's why paradoxes aren't bugs in philosophy. They're the raw material, the fuel. They expose the hidden seams in thinking, the moments where reason gets tired and gives up, where logic folds into metaphor, where silence starts to mean more than speech. And nowhere is this more beautifully terrifying than in the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a man who wrote only one book and then decided it was wrong. His Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus tried to map language to say, this is how meaning works, this is how the world must be structured. But by the end of the book, he changed his mind. He wrote, "My propositions serve as elucidations. He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless." He was trying to build a ladder of logic, but once it had been climbed, he insisted it must be thrown away. The very sentences of the book were designed to self-destruct, like a philosophical suicide note. Why? Because language, he realized, cannot explain itself. Just like the eye cannot see itself, or the brain cannot think about thought without twisting into a loop. And the more you study language, the more it reveals its cracks. Take the sentence, "I always lie." If that's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's true. Or, "This statement is unprovable." If you can prove it, it's false. If you can't prove it, it's true, but unprovable. That's Gödel again, hiding in plain sight. The snake biting its own tail. Every formal system, math, logic, language, eventually runs into a limit. A blind spot it cannot escape. And when it does, it doesn't collapse. It doesn't explode. It quietly dissolves. That's the trick. Paradoxes don't scream. They whisper. They say, "You've gone as far as reason allows." And what lies beyond is not madness. It's something older, something deeper, something closer to music than math. Zen monks called it satori, a flash of insight that comes not from answers, but from giving up the need to ask. Nietzsche hinted at it when he said, "All things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power, not truth." He knew that language bends, that meaning can be manipulated, that logic can be weaponized, and once that truth is known, it never unroots itself. It lives in every argument, every ideology, every quiet internal monologue that says, "I'm right." Because rightness, it turns out, is often just a well-told story. But the stories we tell ourselves are not harmless. Some of them trap us, like the belief that every problem must have a solution, or that the world must make sense, or that human thought is capable of reaching final truth. These are comforting ideas, but they are myths, and paradoxes are the cracks that let the light in. They say, maybe sense-making itself is limited, maybe certainty is a kind of blindness, and if that's true, then perhaps confusion is not a problem to solve, but a state to inhabit. A quiet room where thought sits with itself and listens, not to answers, but to the spaces between them. That's what Gödel gave us, what Wittgenstein wrestled with, what the Zen masters laughed at. For hours. A paradox is not just a statement, it's a mirror, and when we look into it, we don't see logic, we see ourselves, the part that wants to know, the part that refuses not to know, the part that, even now, is listening and wondering and reaching towards something it can feel but not describe. That feeling? That's the paradox. It lives in the edges of awareness, in the flicker between insight and silence, in the space between words, where the deepest meanings hide. And maybe that's where we should be looking all along. There is a paradox that hides inside every attempt to explain reality. It begins the moment the mind says, "This is how things are." Because to describe reality is to step outside of it, to draw a line around it, to name it from some imagined vantage point above it. But we are not above it. We are inside it, swimming in it, made of it, and yet we try endlessly to objectify it, to study the mind using the mind, to capture experience using tools that are themselves part of the experience. It's like trying to lift a chair while sitting in it. It feels possible until you try. This is the paradox of self-reference, and it haunts every field of knowledge. In logic, it creates contradictions. In philosophy, it creates doubt. In consciousness, it creates the illusion of a stable self. But it's not a flaw in the system, it is the system. The very structure of human thought is recursive. Feedback loops built on top of feedback loops. Sensations that cause thoughts that cause more sensations. A self that observes itself observing. There is no base layer, no solid ground. Only layers of awareness floating on each other like reflections in still water. And when the water ripples, we call it thought. But underneath it all, we are still watching, still wondering, still unable to see the watcher. And this inability, this recursive blindness, is not new. Philosophers have stared into it for millennia. Plotinus, in the 3rd century, said the one, the source of all, could not be described because to describe it was to divide it. And the undivided cannot be understood by division. Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching wrote that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Because once named, the Tao becomes a concept, not a reality. And reality, he said, is not a thing. It is the uncarved block, the silent rhythm, the nameless way. What they were all pointing to is this: reality resists representation. And every time we try to pin it down, it slips, just like time. Try to grasp it. Try to say now and freeze it. By the time the word leaves your lips, it is already gone. Because now doesn't exist, not as a point, only as a flow. And yet we build entire lives around trying to hold it still. We take photographs, write journals, make lists. We measure seconds, minutes, years, as if time were a hallway and we are walking through it. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe time is the one walking, and we are the hallway. And memory? Memory is just the shadow it leaves behind. This is why time feels so strange, why childhood feels close and far at the same time, why last year sometimes feels more vivid than last week. Because time is not linear. It bends to emotion. It coils in moments of crisis. It stretches in boredom. It folds in grief. And sometimes it vanishes altogether. This too is a paradox, that the thing we live inside of most, time, is also the thing we understand least. Physicist Carlo Rovelli once wrote that time doesn't exist at the smallest levels of physics, that the flow we feel is not in the math, it's in us. So what is the present moment, then, if not an illusion? And yet, it's the only place anything happens. It's the only point we can ever live from. So we are caught between the illusion of permanence and the necessity of presence. And in that trap, paradox lives. And still we try to make sense of it. We draw timelines, build calendars, tell stories, because stories give time shape. They give it direction, and they give us something else too, identity. Because a self too is a story, a narrative built from memory, bound by language, shaped by culture. And yet, if you search for it, you never find it. There is no core, no center, only changing states, a voice, a history, a repetition of certain habits, but nothing solid, nothing final. This too is unsettling and beautiful, because it means we are not fixed. We are not trapped in what we think we are. We are always becoming, always unfolding, always both who we were and who we are not yet. That's why every paradox of logic is also a paradox of identity, because when we hit the limits of explanation, we also hit the limits of self. And beyond that, something waits. Not nothing, but not something either. A silence, a space, a mystery. And in that mystery, maybe, is the closest thing to truth we'll ever find. Not because it can be said, but because it cannot. And because in not saying, we are finally free to listen. There is a strange comfort in believing that truth is simple, that it hides behind puzzles like a prize behind a curtain. But the deeper philosophy goes, the less truth looks like something waiting to be revealed, and more like something that cannot be owned, Not because it hides, but because it shifts. Not because it lies, but because it refuses to sit still. This is the unsettling beauty of paradoxes. They remind us that certainty is often just inertia, the mind coasting on what it thinks it knows. But when a paradox appears, everything slows. The wheel stutters, the map folds in on itself, and we are left not with confusion, but with possibility, with the realization that some questions are not meant to be answered, they are meant to be held, turned over. Felt one such question lives quietly at the edge of language. It asks, what is a definition? To define is to draw a boundary, to separate one thing from another. But how do we define the act of defining without already having used it? How do we define words using other words without creating a circle? This is the problem of semantic holism, the idea that no single word can be understood on its own, that every meaning depends on every other. Like a spiderweb where pulling one thread shifts the whole. Try defining truth without using words like fact, reality, or accurate. But those words too need defining, and round it goes. The system closes in on itself. This is not just a linguistic curiosity, it's a mirror for the mind, because thought itself is recursive, built in layers. The moment we think about thinking, we create another layer, and with every layer, the chance of contradiction grows. This is why self-reference is so powerful, and so dangerous, because it exposes the limits of our own clarity. And if we are honest, most beliefs are not built on clarity. They are built on repetition, familiarity. The brain likes what it knows, and what it knows best is what it hears most often. This is the illusory truth effect, the cognitive bias that makes repeated statements feel more true simply because they are familiar. A lie told once is a lie. A lie told 100 times becomes a truth the body feels. This is why propaganda works, why slogans repeat, why myths survive. Not because they're true, but because they sound like home. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned of this, that the real danger of totalitarianism was not brute force but the erosion of meaning, the slow, quiet normalization of lies, until the lie becomes the air, the background, the new logic. And people no longer know what they believe, only what feels familiar. But familiarity is not truth, it is comfort, and comfort is often what we seek most, even in paradox, especially in paradox. Because paradoxes let us say, see, it's not just me who's confused, even logic gets lost, even math stumbles, even language collapses. And that's true, but if we stop there, we miss the point. Paradoxes are not where thought ends, they are where deeper thought begins, where the surface cracks, where the hidden machinery shows itself. And one of the most quietly terrifying pieces of that machinery is incompleteness. Gödel showed us that in any system complex enough to describe arithmetic, there will be truths that cannot be proven within the system. Let that settle. It means there will always be facts that are true, but unprovable, knowledge without proof, meaning without evidence, truth that cannot be touched. This idea haunted Gödel. It broke Hilbert's dream of a complete, perfect, logical foundation for mathematics. It also shook the foundations of philosophy, which had long believed that reason could one day explain everything. But Gödel said no, not because he wanted to, but because the logic itself said so. His proof was airtight, unarguable, and in its cold precision, it whispered something quietly mystical. That truth is larger than logic. That reality contains more than what can be proven, and that there is always an outside, always a beyond. But most people don't live in that space. They live in the illusion of closure, of system, of answers that fit neatly in books, laws, ideologies. But those answers are often just placeholders, symbols standing in for something much deeper, much older, something felt, not calculated, and maybe that's what paradox is trying to tell us, that the mind alone is not enough. That reason, beautiful as it is, cannot walk the whole path. It gets us close, it maps the terrain, but at the edge it must stop, and from there, something else must take over. Maybe it's silence, maybe it's awe, maybe it's just listening, or maybe it's the realization that not all things must be known to be real, that some truths, like love or death or time, are not meant to be solved, only witnessed, and that in the witnessing we become more than knowers. We become part of the mystery itself. There's a paradox that slips beneath most conversations without ever being noticed. It's the assumption that we all mean the same thing when we use the same word. But language doesn't work like that. Meaning isn't fixed, it moves, it breathes, it depends. Say the word freedom to 10 different people, and you'll get 10 different meanings. Some hear it as liberty from control, others as license to dominate. Some see it as the absence of interference, others as the presence of dignity. And yet we keep speaking as if we all agree on what we're saying, as if words were transparent. But they aren't. They're mirrors. They reflect the speaker back to themselves. This is the paradox of shared meaning. The more we believe we're on the same page, the less we notice how differently we're reading it. And nowhere is this more dangerous than in ideologies, because ideologies depend on agreement, on common definitions, on phrases like justice, equality, truth, democracy. But what is justice? Plato thought it was harmony between the parts of the soul. Aristotle thought it was giving each their due. The Romans thought it was law. The Enlightenment thinkers thought it was individual rights. Modern governments say it's fairness, but then define fairness in terms of outcomes or procedures or intentions, depending on what they want to justify. So when someone says, we must fight for justice, what do they mean? Which version? Which history? Which definitions have been silently smuggled in? That's the trap. Language looks clear, but it's soaked in ambiguity. And when ambiguity wears the costume of certainty, we get dogma. We get slogans that feel right, even when they mean nothing. We get belief systems that are logically airtight because they never actually touch the ground. They float, self-reinforcing, perfectly circular. And the scariest part, we often don't see it, because the human brain is addicted to coherence. It wants the pieces to fit, so it fills in gaps, it ignores contradictions, it smooths over rough edges. This is the confirmation bias. The brain filters new information through what it already believes, but deeper still is the cognitive dissonance principle. The mind hates holding two contradictory ideas, so it bends one of them, or buries it, or rewrites it. And this happens not because people are irrational, but because the brain is designed to protect its sense of self, and the self is built from belief. So if a belief crumbles, the self trembles. That's why paradoxes feel dangerous, because they don't just challenge ideas, they challenge identity. They whisper, maybe the way you think is flawed, maybe the very act of thinking has limits. And that's terrifying, but it's also liberating, because it means you're not trapped by your beliefs. You can watch them, question them, step outside them, even if only for a moment. That moment is everything. The crack where change gets in. And some philosophers have built their entire worldview on that crack. Søren Kierkegaard called it the leap of faith. Not a leap into religion, as many assume, but a leap out of rationality. A recognition that reason alone cannot justify the deepest truths of life. Love, death, purpose, despair. These require something else. Not blind belief, but honest vulnerability. The willingness to live in the gap, the tension, the unknown. And Friedrich Nietzsche, he said that when one looks long into the abyss also looks back. But he didn't mean despair, he meant reflection. That in facing the void, we find ourselves. Not the self of habit or name, but the deeper self. The one that exists before thought, before story, before logic. This is the self that knows silence. And silence is where paradoxes live, not to be solved, but to be witnessed. And when we witness them fully, not resisting, not fleeing, something softens. We stop trying to win the argument. We stop needing to be right. We begin to see knowledge not as possession, but as participation. A dance, not a victory. And in that dance, even the unsolvable becomes beautiful. Not because we cracked the code, but because we let the code crack us, because we allowed the limits of thought to show us the shape of wonder. And that wonder might be the closest we ever come to truth. There is a kind of truth that hides in contradiction, a truth that does not arrive with answers, but with discomfort, with the eerie sensation that something is wrong, and yet somehow also more right than anything else. This is the domain of paradox, and to live among paradoxes is to give up the need for easy coherence, to trade certainty for a deeper kind of attention, the kind that listens with its skin, with its breath, with the stillness between thoughts. One of the most haunting paradoxes of all is the paradox of tolerance, famously described by philosopher Karl Popper. He said that unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If a society is tolerant without limit, it is eventually destroyed by the intolerant. In order to maintain a tolerant society, we must be intolerant of intolerance. It sounds simple, but it's not, because it folds in on itself. It demands exclusion in the name of inclusion. It asks for boundaries in the name of openness. And it forces us to admit that some principles are only possible if we are willing to break them. That is the ghost inside every ideal, that it must be protected by something messier, something rougher, something more willing to get its hands dirty. Justice needs power, peace needs defense, even love perhaps needs the ability to say no. And that means paradox is not just a philosophical toy, it is the structure of every value we hold. The moment we try to apply any principle universally, we find the edge where it begins to destroy itself. Forgiveness without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Honesty without compassion becomes cruelty. Freedom without responsibility becomes chaos. So we are always balancing, always contradicting ourselves, always holding opposites. And the wisest people in history have not been the ones who resolved these contradictions, but the ones who lived inside them. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations about the importance of letting go of control, while also stressing the discipline of self-mastery. He said to surrender to fate, and yet also to act with moral integrity. At first glance, this is incoherent, but read closely, and it reveals something deeper. A recognition that life is not about choosing one side of a polarity, but about weaving between them. The dance of tension, the wisdom of restraint paired with the courage to act. It is not logic, it is poise, it is the stillness in motion, the capacity to move and yet remain unmoved. This is the kind of intelligence paradox calls for. Not just intellect, but soul. The ability to feel the weight of opposites and not flinch, and it shows up everywhere. In leadership, in love, in ethics. A leader must be decisive, yet humble. A lover must be vulnerable, yet strong. A thinker must be skeptical, yet open. These are not contradictions to be solved. They are tensions to be lived. And the refusal to live them, the need for clean answers, for binary certainty, that is what gives rise to extremism, to fundamentalism, to the rigidity that cracks under pressure. Because the world is not binary, it is layered, nuanced, alive, and aliveness cannot be compressed into logic without something vital being lost. That is what so many systems of thought forget. They build frameworks, theologies, manifestos, but they forget the pulse, the mystery, the aching tension that makes it real. And that tension, that is the paradox. Not a bug, not a failure, but the very texture of truth. Because truth, when fully felt, hurts a little. It stretches the mind, it humbles the heart, it leaves us not with conclusions, but with presence. And maybe that's the goal. not to arrive at answers, but to arrive in awareness, to be fully here, with the complexity, with the mess, with the contradiction that says this too is true, and so is its opposite. And that's okay, that's more than okay, that's life, alive and flickering, like a candle in the dark. There is something quietly maddening about language, something that hides beneath the surface of every conversation, every thought, every whispered truth we try to hold still. It is this, that words do not point to reality, they point to other words. Each term defined by another, in a circle that never lands, never settles, never finally touches the thing itself. This is the infinite regress of language, the paradox at the root of speech. That meaning is always just beyond the next definition, just past the next sentence, always vanishing into the distance like a shadow that moves when chased. And yet we build entire worlds with words. We fall in love through them. We declare wars with them. We name gods and countries and identities with syllables as fragile as breath. It works mostly, until it doesn't. Until the moment a word fails. Until someone says, "I'm fine," and means something else. Until someone says, "truth," and means "my side." Until the phrase "for your safety" becomes a mask for control. Language can be a bridge, but it can also be a maze, a fog, a veil. And when the veil lifts, we don't always see clarity. Sometimes we see the terrifying quiet of meaninglessness, the realization that maybe words were never enough, that maybe they're just gestures, elegant, echoing, but always incomplete. This is not a new idea. It haunted the philosopher Derrida, who argued that language never truly reaches outside itself. That meaning is always deferred. A concept he called difference, a term deliberately misspelled to signal its own slipperiness. It is not just difference, it is delay, a postponing of presence, an endless dance of signifiers circling an absence. But this absence is not empty. It is full of potential, of play, of the very thing that makes language possible, the gap. The gap between what is said and what is meant, between what is meant and what is heard, between what is heard and what is understood. And in this gap, misunderstanding blooms, irony, humour, poetry, deceit, seduction, power. All of it lives in the space where meanings bend, and bend they do. Language is not fixed, it evolves. Words that once meant purity become slurs. Words that once oppressed are reclaimed. A phrase can carry violence or tenderness, depending on the eyes and ears it meets. And sometimes, the same sentence can be both, beautiful and cruel, sincere and manipulative, true and false at once. This is not a flaw, it is the nature of language, and it mirrors the nature of thought. Because the mind too is layered, full of subtext, full of contradiction. It says one thing while meaning another. It believes and doubts at once. It rationalizes, it performs, it forgets. And yet we trust it. We call it mine. But who is the me that owns the mind? Is it the voice that speaks, or the silence that watches? Is it the pattern of thoughts, or the awareness behind them? And if thoughts are shaped by language, and language is shaped by culture, then where exactly does the self begin? This is the paradox of identity, that the more we try to define who we are, the more we discover that we are made of things we didn't choose. Language, history, biology, memory. The self is not a thing. It is a process, a flickering pattern, a dance between brain and body and world. And like language, it changes, moment to moment, day to day. It has no core, no final truth, just layers, just stories, just names whispered into the dark. And if this feels unsettling, good, because the mind wants anchors, it wants something solid to cling to. But paradox is the ocean that reminds us there is no shore, only movement, only rhythm, and to float in it is not to be lost, but to be free. Free from the illusion that things must always make sense, free from the trap of perfect clarity, free from the false comfort of words pretending to be reality. Because reality is not a sentence, it is not a definition, it is not a thought, it is the thing that thought tries and fails to touch, the thing that silence sometimes feels closer to than speech. And in that silence, perhaps, is the real language, the one that does not name, does not define, does not separate, but simply is. There is a question that breaks logic not with noise, but with stillness. It asks, can a system explain itself completely, from within itself, using only the tools it contains? And the answer, proven by Gödel, is no. No matter how rigorous the rules, no matter how elegant the structure, every system of thought has truths it cannot see, questions it cannot ask, limits it cannot cross. And this is not a flaw, it is a feature. It is the built-in humility of reality, that no map is the territory, no concept is the thing it describes. But the mind resists this. It wants closure, finality, the satisfying click of certainty. And so it forgets the margins, it forgets the shadows, it forgets that every conclusion casts a silence just outside its edge. This silence is where paradox lives, not as an enemy of truth, but as its guardian. A reminder that the deepest truths are not neat, they are not symmetrical, they do not resolve like equations, they twist, they echo, they undo. This is what makes them feel alive, and alive things are not static, they change shape, they grow, they contradict. This is why no worldview can be final, why every ideology, no matter how noble, will one day be questioned. Because to believe something completely is to stop asking. And when we stop asking, we lose contact with wonder, with the trembling edge of the unknown. And the unknown is not empty, it is full of meanings that do not yet have names, full of realities we have not yet imagined, full of selves we have not yet become. But to approach it, we must let go of the need for control, for linearity, for the illusion that everything can be organized, boxed, labeled. Because some truths refuse to be tamed. They arrive as feelings, as dreams, as contradictions that will not resolve. And the moment we try to force them into coherence, they vanish, like the wave that collapses when measured, like the joke that dies when explained. Truth is not always something we reach. Sometimes it is something we notice, something that was always there, but unseeable while we were busy being right. That's why paradox is so powerful. It shakes us loose from certainty. It shows us that the world is not built the way we thought. That meaning is not found by slicing things apart, but by sitting with their tension, by being present with the ache of ambiguity. And there's no better example of this than the liar's paradox, a sentence that says, this statement is false. If it is true, then it is false. If it is false, then it is true. The mind loops. It has no exit, because the statement refers to itself in a way that logic cannot resolve. And this, Gödel showed, is not just a trick. It is a glimpse into the architecture of logic itself, into the limits of formal systems, into the way meaning eats its own tail. And from this, he proved something quietly devastating, that even in the coldest, most precise realm of mathematics, there will always be statements that are true but unprovable. That truth is larger than proof, and that any attempt to fully capture it, in language, in logic, in reason, will leave something out. But what is left out is not an error. It is the doorway, the threshold, the place where thought gives way to something else, something quieter, slower, more aware. This is what mystics have always whispered, that there is a kind of knowing beyond thought, a knowing that feels more than it defines, that listens more than it speaks, that asks not, what is the answer, but what is the question hiding from me? And often, what hides is the question itself, the assumption behind it, the invisible framework. This is why Zen koans were never meant to be solved. They were meant to unmake the mind that needs solutions. They were designed to break the craving for explanation, to leave the thinker staring into the space beyond words, where something else begins. Maybe not knowledge, but wisdom, the kind that grows in silence, in humility, in the willingness to be confused. And in that confusion, paradox becomes a teacher, not a puzzle, but a mirror. And in the mirror, we see not logic, not truth, but ourselves. The ones who ask, the ones who reach, the ones who, even now, are listening in the dark. There is something quietly tragic about the way human beings search for truth, not because truth is unreachable, but because the very tools we use to seek it are shaped by things we rarely question. Our language, our logic, our assumptions, our fear of being wrong. And so we build elaborate systems, philosophies, sciences, belief structures, not to explore the unknown, but to defend ourselves from it. We call it curiosity, but often it's fear dressed in reason's clothing. The fear that nothing is solid, that nothing can be finally known, that we are floating in something far too vast for our minds to hold. And instead of falling into that vastness with reverence, we panic, we grasp, we name, we reduce. But some things will not be reduced. They cannot be captured without being killed. Truth, when it is alive, resists capture. It flickers, it contradicts, it laughs at categories. It hides in the gap between what we say and what we feel, between what we believe and what we do. And that gap, that silent space of not knowing, is where philosophy begins. Not in answers, but in awe. In the trembling realization that all our maps are just guesses, that our best theories are still shadows on the wall. And perhaps the most beautiful shadow of all is the idea of self. We say I as if it's a single thing, a fixed, clean identity. But the closer we look, the more it falls apart. Is the self the body, but the body changes? Cells die and are replaced. Is it memory? But memories shift. They fade. They lie. Is it personality? But personalities evolve. What we liked at 20 embarrasses us at 30. What we feared at 10 becomes nostalgia at 50. So where is the self? What is it? And why are we so afraid of letting it go? Buddhism calls the self an illusion. Not a lie exactly, more like a mirage, a pattern that appears stable only because it is repeating. Like a whirlpool in a river, there is motion, there is shape, but there is no thing, no object, just process, just flow. And yet this illusion of self is what much of our suffering clings to, because to protect the self, we must defend our story, our opinions, our status, our importance, even when it hurts, even when it makes us cruel. We fear death because we fear the end of self. We fear rejection because we fear the shrinking of self. We fear silence because it dissolves the edges of self. But what if that dissolving is not death, but freedom? What if the self was never meant to be held so tightly? What if the deepest peace comes not from knowing who we are, but from letting go of the need to know? This is not the same as nihilism. It is not despair. It is the opposite. It is the quiet joy of recognizing that we are not objects in the world, but movements within it. Not nouns, but verbs. Not fixed, but unfolding. And when we truly understand this, not just intellectually, but in our bones, a new kind of clarity emerges. A soft, flexible clarity. The kind that does not fight paradox, but bows to it. That does not cling to certainty, but rests in the unknown. This is what mystics and poets and some of the wisest philosophers have tried to tell us. That beneath all our seeking is a stillness, a presence, a silent awareness untouched by thought. It cannot be spoken, only pointed to. It cannot be understood, only lived. And when we rest there, even for a moment, the need to solve everything fades. The need to be right dissolves. The war inside quiets. And in that quiet, we see that paradox is not our enemy. It is our teacher, because it returns us to humility. It breaks the illusion that we are in control, that we can fix the world with logic, that we can fix ourselves with knowledge. Knowledge is useful, yes, but wisdom begins where knowledge ends. Wisdom begins in surrender, in the willingness to live in the question, in the courage to be confused, to not know, to listen anyway. And this kind of listening is not passive. It is alert, reverent, awake. It listens not just to words but to silences, not just to facts but to feelings, not just to logic but to contradiction. And in that listening, we begin to see that everything we thought was solid, the self, the world, even time, is soft, malleable, paradoxical. And maybe that's not a flaw in the system. Maybe it's the invitation. There's a strange kind of mirror that logic holds up to itself, and when it stares too long, it begins to blur. This is not metaphor. This is mathematics. In 1931, Kurt Gödel published something that would quietly tear a hole in the foundation of everything we thought we could prove. A theorem clean and strange that showed us that in any consistent system of mathematics, there will always be truths that cannot be proven within that system. Think about that. It's not that we haven't figured them out yet. It's that they cannot be reached at all. No matter how smart we get, no matter how many equations we write, no matter how far we push reason, this isn't just a math problem. It's a philosophical earthquake. It means that certainty, that golden thing so many people chase, is smaller than truth. That there will always be facts sitting just outside the reach of proof. And more than that, any system that is strong enough to describe the basics of arithmetic is also strong enough to describe a statement about itself. And that's where the cracks appear. Because once a system turns back to describe itself, paradoxes enter like ghosts. The system becomes aware of its own shape. It folds inward. It becomes, in a sense, conscious. And this self-reference, while elegant, introduces a fundamental limit. It's like trying to weigh a scale with itself. It doesn't fail because it's wrong. It fails because it's trying to observe itself, using itself. And that loop, that beautiful, terrible loop, lives not just in math, but in the mind. Because the brain too is a system that thinks about itself, a machine that maps the world while being part of the world. And so we face the same paradox. We can describe the mind, but only with the mind. We can analyze thoughts, but only with other thoughts. We can reflect on reflection, but never from the outside. And so the question appears again, can we ever know ourselves fully? Can we ever see the whole system we are part of from inside that system? Or will there always be a blind spot, a place thought cannot reach? Neuroscientist David Eagleman once said, "The brain is like a flashlight trying to illuminate itself. It can get close, it can shine in mirrors, but it cannot ever quite see the hand that's holding the light. And yet, we try. We try to understand consciousness. We try to trace the self. We try to explain emotions and memory and identity in neural patterns. And we learn a lot, but the deeper we go, the more we find that explanation is not the same as experience. That breaking something into parts does not reveal its essence. That the map, no matter how detailed, never becomes the land. And so science, brilliant and powerful as it is, reaches a boundary. And that boundary is not ignorance, it is paradox. Not because science is failing, but because reality is stranger than explanation. This is why every spiritual tradition, every deep philosophy, eventually turns quiet. Not because it ran out of ideas, but because it ran out of language. Lao Tzu wrote, "He who speaks does not know. He who knows does not speak." And perhaps what he meant was not that silence is superior, but that silence is the only thing large enough to hold the contradictions. That speech is always a compression, a narrowing, and sometimes truth needs more space than words can give. This is not anti-intellectual. It's not mysticism for the sake of mystery. It's a recognition of limits. And limits are beautiful because they show us where the known ends and where presence begins. The presence of being, of stillness, of attention that does not need to divide or prove or explain. And in that presence, something strange happens. We stop needing to solve everything. We stop needing to win the argument. We stop needing to know whether the self is real or free will exists, or the mind is just an illusion. We start listening, not with the ears but with the whole body, with a kind of soft openness that doesn't collapse paradox but holds it, that doesn't reduce mystery but honours it. And from that place something like peace begins to emerge. A peace not made of answers, but of the quiet confidence that not everything must be answered, that some truths are too large, too alive, too rich to ever be compressed into logic. They can only be lived, felt, touched in silence. And maybe that's what Gödel was really pointing to. Not just a limit in mathematics, but a window, a gap in the wall of reason where light comes through. Not the blinding light of certainty, but the soft glow of humility. The realization that the mind, magnificent as it is not the whole of who we are. That truth, like beauty, may sometimes be clearest not when we grasp for it, but when we stop grasping. There is something haunting about circular logic. It feels like thinking, but it isn't. It imitates reason while quietly tying itself into knots. A claim supports itself by referencing itself. A belief justifies itself by being believed. And when this pattern goes unnoticed, it becomes a trap. Not just in arguments, but in lives, in ideologies, in entire worldviews. People believe what they believe not because it's true, but because they already believe it. Evidence is interpreted through the filter of what they already assume. And every piece of new information is either accepted if it confirms the belief, or rejected if it threatens it. The system defends itself, it becomes airtight, and the tighter it gets, the less oxygen it allows in. This is the paradox of belief, that the more certain someone becomes, the less they see. Because certainty is not clarity, it is closure. And closure is comfortable, it feels safe, but it's a safety that comes at a cost. The cost of curiosity, the cost of open-ended thinking, the cost of wondering, what if I'm wrong? And this is not just a human flaw, it is a human feature. Because evolution did not select for truth, it selected for survival, for coherence, for social belonging. The mind that fit in was safer than the mind that questioned. The tribe protected those who echoed, not those who doubted. And so we evolved to conform, to repeat, to trust what others trust. And what gets repeated becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar feels true. This is the illusory truth effect, studied by Hasher, Goldstein, and Topino in 1977. They found that people rate repeated statements as more true than new ones, even if they're false. It's not logic, it's familiarity. The brain is comforted by patterns, even if the pattern is a lie. And once a belief feels true, it becomes part of identity. And identity is not lightly challenged. To question it feels like self-annihilation, like death. So we double down, we defend, we rationalize, and slowly the logic becomes circular. It isn't meant to deceive, it just happens. A kind of mental gravity, a tightening spiral. And if we're not paying attention, we begin to speak in loops. I know I'm right because I know I'm right. That can't be true because I don't believe it. This must be real because it feels real. But feelings, too, are shaped by beliefs. And beliefs are shaped by repetition. And repetition is not truth. It is just noise with memory. So how do we break the circle? How do we know when our thinking is thinking in circles? The answer is not more thinking, it is more awareness. Awareness of pattern, of reaction, of language itself. Because circular logic often hides in language, in phrases like, it's obvious, or everyone knows, or that's just how it is. These are not arguments, they are shields, and they protect not truth, but habit. The habit of believing without questioning, of speaking without listening, of repeating without thinking. And yet the solution is not to attack belief, not to shame or mock or dismiss. That only reinforces the spiral, makes it tighten, makes it stronger. The only way out is softness, curiosity, The gentle invitation to pause, to reflect, to ask, where did this belief come from? What is it protecting? What would happen if I let it go? And this is hard, not intellectually, but emotionally. Because beliefs are not just thoughts, they are anchors. They hold identity in place, and to loosen them feels like drifting, like losing oneself. But maybe that's not loss. Maybe it's space to grow, to see, to change. This is what Socrates did, not by preaching, but by questioning, by walking the streets of Athens, asking things so simple they became dangerous. What is justice? What is courage? How do you know? He was killed for it. Because questions are threatening. They unravel, they unmake, they expose the circularity at the heart of so many systems. And when the system is built on repetition, on inherited truth, on unexamined logic, questions become revolution. Even small ones, especially small ones, because they don't shout. They whisper, and paradox is the quietest question of all. It doesn't scream that something is wrong. It simply shows that something doesn't fit, that the pieces, while beautiful alone, break when assembled. That logic, when it turns inward, creates loops. That belief, when it becomes too certain, becomes blind. And so paradox does not destroy belief. It softens it. It loosens the grip. It invites us to sit with the unknown, to tolerate ambiguity, to accept that some things cannot be solved, only lived. And in that living, something strange happens. We become more free, not because we know more, but because we need to know less. We stop demanding that the world make perfect sense, and we begin to see it not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a mystery to be witnessed. And in that witnessing, circular logic becomes visible, not as a failure, but as a pattern. And once we see the pattern, we are no longer trapped inside it. We can step back, we can smile, we can ask better questions, and we can begin, gently, to think again. There's a strange psychological trick buried deep in the architecture of the human mind. It's quiet, almost invisible, but it shapes nearly every belief, every memory, every decision. It's this: the mind doesn't store truth, it stores familiarity, and what feels familiar slowly starts to feel true. This is the illusion of repeated exposure. The more often we hear something, the more real it seems. Not because we've checked it, not because we've reasoned through it, but because the repetition has made it comfortable, safe, known. This is the core of the illusory truth effect. And it's not a bug, it's how cognition evolved. In a dangerous world, the familiar was less likely to be a threat, so the brain became biased toward recognition, toward patterns, toward whatever showed up often, and over time, it confused frequency with fact. Familiarity became a stand-in for truth. This makes sense in the wild, but in a world of language it creates a trap, because in language, repetition is easy. Memes, headlines, political slogans, social media algorithms, echo chambers. The more often an idea appears, the more familiar it becomes, and the more true it feels, even if it's wrong, even if it's nonsense, even if it contradicts itself. And the scary part is this: we don't notice it happening. We feel certain, we feel informed, but we're just remembering what we've seen before. Truth sticks to the mind like wet leaves, not because it's grounded, but because it's everywhere. And when this happens in public discourse, it changes society. The loudest ideas become the most trusted. The simplest narratives become the most powerful. Not because they explain more, but because they circulate more. They go viral. They become mantras. And soon, they become identity. People start to repeat the phrases not just because they believe them, but because the phrases have become who they are. Make America great again. Believe science. No justice, no peace. Simple, rhythmic, repeatable. And repetition is power. Not persuasion, not logic, just pattern. The human brain is an echo chamber, and inside that chamber, truth becomes a function of frequency. This has been exploited by propagandists for centuries. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, understood it perfectly. Repeat a lie often enough, and it becomes the truth. It works then, it works now. Not because people are stupid, but because repetition bypasses skepticism. It doesn't argue, it just repeats. And repetition wears down resistance, it smooths over doubt, and eventually it starts to feel obvious, like something we always knew. But what happens when obviousness becomes a weapon? When it's used not to illuminate, but to control? When ideas are repeated not because they're true, but because they're useful to someone? Useful to power, to profit, to narrative control. Then we enter a strange territory, one where truth and usefulness are indistinguishable, where belief is just a product of exposure. And in that world, the person who controls the signal controls the belief. The one who speaks most wins, and if not wins, at least shapes reality. That's why censorship is not always the biggest threat to truth. Sometimes noise is worse, not silence, but flooding, burying the truth beneath a mountain of repetition, making it one signal among thousands, diluting its power, making it forgettable, and the mind, overwhelmed, reaches for the thing it recognizes, not the thing that's correct. This isn't just theory, it's been tested. In a 2015 study, researchers found that people rated repeated false claims as more accurate than new true ones, even after being told beforehand that repetition would bias them. Awareness didn't help. The effect still happened. Because it's preconscious, it's a pattern detection mechanism. It runs deeper than logic. And this means that education alone isn't protection. Intelligence isn't immunity. Even the brightest minds are vulnerable. In fact, sometimes intelligence makes it worse. Because the smarter the person, the better they are at rationalizing, at defending what feels true, at constructing elegant arguments around a feeling they haven't questioned. And that feeling is often just familiarity. This is what makes certain forms of belief so hard to untangle. They don't rest on evidence, they rest on comfort, on echo, on the gentle hypnosis of having heard something again and again. And paradoxically, the more confident someone feels, the more likely they are to be deep in the illusion. Because confidence is not clarity, it is just fluency. And fluency comes from repetition. So what's the antidote? How do we guard against this? Not by rejecting everything, not by becoming cynical, but by becoming slow, by listening for the rhythm of repetition, by noticing when an idea feels true and asking why. Where did it come from? How many times have I heard it? What's at stake if I believe it? Who benefits? And most importantly, does it feel true because it's familiar, or because I've actually thought about it? These questions don't always lead to certainty, but they lead to awareness. And awareness is the first crack in the illusion. It doesn't break the spell all at once, but it lets in light. And that light, the light of inquiry, of attention, of soft skepticism, is what separates thinking from echoing. It's what allows us to hold truth, not as something we inherit, but as something we meet, something we sit with, something we test and retest, even if it feels uncomfortable, especially then. Because the deepest truths are not always the ones we've heard the most. Sometimes they're the ones we've almost never heard at all. There is a strange kind of blindness that hides behind the eyes of certainty. Not the blindness of ignorance, but the blindness of assumption. The kind that doesn't feel like blindness at all. It feels like knowledge, like clarity, like truth. But beneath it is a quiet, invisible structure, a scaffolding of presuppositions, hidden metaphors, and unexamined categories. We do not see the world as it is. We see it through filters we forgot we were wearing. And one of the deepest filters is logic itself, the rules of reason. The way we think thinking should work. But logic is not neutral. It was invented, refined, designed to mimic certain forms of clarity, forms that comfort the linear mind. Logic assumes that contradiction is a flaw, that a statement cannot be both true and false, that a thing must either be or not be. But what if reality does not obey that law? What if reality, like a dream, folds over itself? What if the categories of logic are too narrow for a world this strange? Eastern philosophy has long suggested this, that opposites are not enemies. That duality is illusion. That paradox is not a bug, but a feature. In Taoism, the yin and yang are not contradictions. They are co-arising. They define each other. They give birth to each other. The Tao is not logical. It is alive. It flows. It resists capture. It cannot be spoken, said Lao Tzu, and the moment it is spoken, it is no longer the Tao. This is not poetic mysticism. It is a direct challenge to Western assumptions about knowledge, about the supremacy of reason, about the neatness of the world. And perhaps beneath all our rational systems, we are still craving neatness. Clean lines, final truths. But the more we demand clarity, the more we impose order where there is only flow. We ask questions like, is this true or false, when the answer might be yes. We demand which side is right, when the sides are illusions. And when paradox appears, something that is both and neither, we panic. We call it broken, illogical. But maybe it's not the paradox that is broken. Maybe it's our frame. Maybe the logic is too small for the truth. This is not a license for nonsense. It is not a call to abandon reason. It is a call to hold it lightly. To remember that reason is a lens, not a mirror, and every lens distorts, especially when it thinks it doesn't. Take the concept of time. Western thought tends to view it as linear, a line, a sequence of causes and effects, past, present, future. But what if that's just one metaphor? In many indigenous cultures, time is circular. Events are not separate points, but patterns that return. In physics, time is even stranger. It stretches, it slows, it bends around mass. It may not even be fundamental. Some physicists now suspect that time is emergent, a byproduct of entanglement and entropy. And in the deepest equations of quantum gravity, time disappears entirely. Not because nothing is happening, but because happening itself is too primitive a concept. These are not just academic curiosities. They show us that the very structure of our thinking, the way we divide before and after, cause and effect, this or that, is built on assumptions that may not hold. And when those assumptions crack, paradox rushes in. It fills the space left by certainty. And at first it feels like chaos, like something is wrong. But if we listen carefully, we realize it's not chaos. It's complexity, it's depth, it's the sound of a richer truth trying to be heard. The kind of truth that doesn't fit in a slogan, that cannot be posted, that doesn't go viral, because it refuses to simplify, because it resists becoming content. And this is the deeper danger of modern attention, not distraction, but flattening. The way everything is pressed into a narrow shape to be consumed. The way contradictions are edited out for clarity. The way nuance dies in the algorithm. And what we're left with is not understanding, but performance. Not dialogue, but certainty theatre. Everyone broadcasting, no one listening. Everyone correct, no one curious. And in that noise, the paradoxes are the first to disappear. Because they are slow. They are unsettling. They take time. But they are also the most important. Because they hold the seams. They show where the map fails. They whisper, look here, something doesn't fit. And when something doesn't fit, that's where insight begins. That's where evolution happens. Not in comfort, but in contradiction. In the places where the system doesn't explain itself. In the places where the answer is not an answer, but a better question. And maybe the real skill, the one we were never taught, is how to sit with those questions. How to not flinch when the mind can't resolve. How to stay still when logic loops. How to breathe when meaning dissolves. Because the paradox is not trying to confuse, it is trying to wake. to stretch the frame, to remind the mind that it is not the only tool, that there are other ways of knowing, other forms of truth. And maybe the greatest truths are not the ones we explain, but the ones we carry, quietly, wordlessly, as presence, as being, as the soft willingness to not know. What if everything we think of as real is just a trick of language? What if the mind doesn't just describe the world, but builds it out of symbols, labels, signs and silence? Language feels like a window, but it is a mirror. It reflects the structures we assume, the categories we inherit, the binaries we never questioned. We say good and bad, true and false, self and other, as if those words pointed to something fixed and solid. But they don't. They point to patterns in the fog. They draw lines on clouds, and over time, those lines feel real. Real enough to fight wars over, real enough to live and die for. But language is not neutral. It frames, it filters, it hides almost as much as it reveals. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." He wasn't being poetic, he was being precise, because what we cannot say, we can barely see. The way we speak becomes the way we think, and the way we think becomes the way we live. So when we trap ourselves in the logic of either or, in the sterile architecture of black and white, we also trap our emotions, our ethics, our sense of self. We forget that life does not obey grammar, that meaning leaks, that words are always lagging behind the experience. And this is why paradoxes matter, because they break the spell. They reveal the seams. They show where the language we use to name the world starts to fail. Take the Sorites paradox, the heap. Remove one grain of sand from a heap, and it's still a heap. Remove another, still a heap. Keep going. At what point does it stop being a heap? Where is the exact threshold? There is none. But the mind demands a line, so it invents one. It draws it somewhere arbitrary and pretends it's real. This happens with identity too, with race, with gender, with nationality. These things feel binary, solid, but they are constructed out of thousands of invisible grains: culture, biology, history, language, myth. Remove one, and it still feels intact. Remove 100, and it still seems to hold. But slowly, quietly, we are forced to ask, where is the boundary? What makes someone this or that? And the answer is not logic. It is convenience, politics, storytelling. And when we mistake the story for the structure, we start defending illusions as if they were eternal truths. We start killing each other over shadows. This is what the ancient Greeks feared in sophistry, the manipulation of words to control minds. But the danger isn't just manipulation, it's unconsciousness. When we speak without knowing what our words are doing, when we argue without knowing what our logic is hiding, when we define without asking who benefits from the definition. And paradox, again, is the cure. It's the moment when language catches itself, when the mirror bends, when a sentence turns on itself and collapses. I always lie. This sentence is false. There is no absolute truth. Each of these phrases looks like knowledge, but breaks apart under its own weight. They are not just jokes, they are symptoms of a deeper truth, that language cannot hold everything, that meaning spills over, that contradiction is built into the act of saying anything at all. And if we don't see this, we get lost in the surface. We start treating words like bricks instead of like smoke. But if we do see it, if we let paradox teach us, we begin to wake up. We begin to listen differently, speak differently, think differently, not with more certainty, but with more grace, more humility, more reverence for the mystery we're trying to touch. Because the mystery is not the absence of knowledge, it's the excess of it. It's the place where knowing becomes too rich, too complex, too alive to fit inside a sentence. And this excess is not a failure. It is a gift. It is what gives birth to poetry, to myth, to metaphor, to article, because art begins where explanation ends, and paradox is the bridge. It leads us from clarity to complexity, from answer to wonder, from logic to something softer, deeper, stranger. This is why Zen masters give their students riddles that cannot be solved. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Does a dog have Buddha nature? These are not puzzles, they are mirrors. They show the student their own mind, the way it grabs, explains, defines, and the way it breaks when faced with something that refuses to be defined. And that breaking is not defeat, it is awakening. Because in that moment, the student sees that truth is not a conclusion, it is a process, a way of being, a kind of openness, and in that openness something shifts. The war inside quiets, the need to control fades, and what's left is not confusion, but clarity, the kind that no longer demands resolution, the kind that breathes, that watches, that holds both sides of a paradox without choosing, that walks the edge between opposites and finds balance not in either, but in both. And maybe that's what philosophy is, at its deepest, not a system of answers, but a practice of staying awake, of learning how to hold contradiction, of learning how to live without certainty and still move through the world with love. The story just told has now come to its close, a thread gently tied, its images and ideas already sinking into the quieter layers of thought. Yet for those whose minds still drift wakefully, another story begins, one drawn from the ancient words of Lao Tzu, the sage of the Tao, whose voice, though separated from us by centuries, still flows like a river through the valleys of time. In the Tao Te Ching, among its spare and winding verses, lies a paradox, both delicate and immense, that the softest thing in the world, water, can overcome the hardest. The line is simple, almost small enough to miss, yet it holds the weight of a truth seen through long observation. Water, yielding to every shape, bending without resistance, never grasping or striking, wears down stone, slips past obstacles, finds its way where nothing else can pass. To Lao Tzu, this was not a mere observation of nature, but a mirror held to the nature of life, a lesson in patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of what does not contend. The world is full of hardness, rigid thoughts, fixed wills, walls built against change. These, like stone, seem unshakable. Yet water, soft and persistent, seeps into every crack, moves without hurry, and in time reshapes the unmovable. It wins not through force, but through its refusal to be forced. In the stillness of night, one might hear the faint trickle of a stream, or recall the sound of rain against the earth, and know in that sound the presence of something that does not fight, yet cannot be stopped. Lao Tzu's teaching is not a call to weakness, but to a strength that appears in the form of yielding, to a wisdom that sees the futility of rigid struggle, and instead flows around the obstacle, patient enough to wait for the moment when the obstacle itself is changed. Just as water is clear and without fixed form, so the mind freed from clinging can move through the hardness of life without breaking. This is not the strength of a clenched fist, but the strength of open hands, not the shout, but the quiet persistence that endures beyond the noise. In this way, the soft can overcome the hard, and the gentle can master the unyielding, not by defiance, but by a deeper accord with the way of things. In the landscapes Lao Tzu knew, rivers carved valleys over centuries, rain polished mountains into rounded hills, and the sea, without rising in anger, swallowed stone cliffs grain by grain. He saw in these quiet movements a way of being that did not exhaust itself in battles for control. Water never seeks to dominate the stone, yet in the patient arithmetic of time, the stone changes and the water remains. To grasp this is to see that strength does not always declare itself loudly. A rigid branch may snap in the storm, but the reed bends and survives. In human life, hardness often appears as stubborn will, the refusal to yield an inch, the insistence on victory by direct confrontation. This can win a day, a year, even a decade, but like the stone, it must eventually meet something it cannot break. Softness, by contrast, can seem like loss, like giving way, yet when it is guided by purpose, it becomes a force the hard cannot resist. To yield is not to surrender one's nature, it is to preserve it so that it may continue to act. Lao Tzu's water is not passive, for it moves ceaselessly, shaping the course of its own path. It does not cling to the bank it leaves behind, nor resist the turn ahead. It teaches that resilience is not the same as resistance, and that survival often belongs to what can transform without losing itself. In the human mind, water's way becomes a discipline of letting go, of refusing the tightness that closes off new routes, of trusting that forward movement can happen without force. It asks for trust in the unseen work of time, for faith that slow change is still change. In the candle's soft light, one can imagine the long patience of water in a world of stone, moving where there is space, waiting where there is not, knowing that nothing hard can stand forever against what flows without end. The candle gutters and steadies, the room breathing with a small hush of night air, while the mind turns again to the old pages where water is praised for going to the places others avoid. Low, quiet, unclaimed, useful to all and rival to none. Lao Tzu, a figure hovering at the edge of history, perhaps 6th century before the Common Era, perhaps later, a librarian or a recluse or a road traveller who handed a border guard the verses before vanishing, speaks through the compact brightness of the Tao Te Ching, where the highest goodness is likened to water, because it nourishes without demanding, because it does not contend, because it flows to the valley where pride does not dwell. What does it mean to go low and yet to rise? What does it mean to be soft and yet to overcome? A river answers without speech, shaping stone by patience, widening its banks not by decree but by return, again and again, until resistance becomes a curve and not a wall. The sage reads the river as others read a law code, tracing the clauses of motion in every bend, learning that timing is a deeper strength than force, that placement is a subtler power than pressure. A leader who stands above becomes a peak that the clouds pass without touching, but a leader who stands below becomes the sea, gathering all streams, directing without the roughness of command, governing by yielding, receiving by lowering, guiding by being guided. How can one be guided while guiding, and yet not lose direction? The answer moves like silt falling through clear water after the splash is done, a slow settling that reveals the riverbed again, the shape that was there all along, only hidden by turbulence. In the text, the way is not a plan, but a path already present, the current already moving. The art lies in feeling how to float within it, when to paddle, when to drift, when to slip sideways into a smaller channel that avoids the fallen tree. Water keeps no hard memory of the rock it met at dawn. It continues. It takes the next line of least resistance, not from fear, but from clarity, not from weakness, but from the recognition that the goal is distance, not drama. The body understands this teaching before the tongue can phrase it, for blood remembers its rounds. Lymph makes its silent passages. Tears come and go with their salt, and each breath arrives like a small tide that gathers what must be released and leaves what must remain. The mind which loves to strike can instead dissolve, letting a knot loosen by absence of pulling, letting a word emerge when it has ripened rather than when a moment demands a show of strength. What is a knot to water but a pattern that will unmake itself if soaked long enough, if left in the patient bath of attention? In the cliffside temple courtyards of memory, the rain falls for ages on bronze bells and tiled eaves, and the patina that forms is not a wound but a blessing, a softening that time writes as praise for what endures without shouting. The sage watches a torrent and a trickle and sees the same principle. That flow is invincible because it refuses to become a single hard shape, because change is not its enemy but its native tongue. Why chase confrontation when redirection will do? Why push a door inward when it will open outward for a lighter hand? Why harden a face when a pause will cool the heat and make the right sentence possible. The stone speaks only in weight, the water speaks in roots, and roots win. To live as water lives is not to resign, it is to reserve energy for what requires it. To avoid paying the cost of pride for small victories that soon become large regrets, to attend to the landscape rather than the score. The text praises emptiness, not as lack but as capacity. The cup useful because it is hollow. The room useful because it holds unfilled air. The valley rich because it receives what the mountain sheds. The sea lord of streams because it is lower than all. What is low but a promise to carry? What is empty but a promise to welcome? In the palace of strategies, this is scandalous counsel, yet history confirms it quietly, for empires that stiffen break on their own corners, while customs that bend with new times endure like reed mats renewed with each season, altered yet the same. The lesson hides in ordinary hours. A pot over flames that are too fierce cracks, a pot over steady coals cooks through. A letter sent in, anger becomes a sharp pebble in the shoe of years. A letter sent after sleep becomes a clear path, seen in morning light. A schedule packed to its lips spills. A schedule with a hollow at its centre becomes a basin that catches what chance pours in. Water does not think of winning, yet it arrives. It does not promise, yet it keeps going. It does not declare, yet it shapes. Is there a gentler power? The page closes and opens again in the mind, and the small candle offers a living commentary, for the flame achieves its task by consuming itself at a pace that does not rush, for haste would be the speed of loss, while measure is the rhythm of service. Patience is not delay for its own sake, it is alignment with what can be done now, and what must be done by hours that have not yet arrived. It is the wisdom to let time work alongside effort, so that effort is not alone. Resilience is not a helmet, it is a spring, not a wall. It is a curve that returns to form after strain. It is a way of continuing that does not require defiance to prove itself. The night listens as the thought finishes its circle. The sage remains elsewhere, or everywhere, saying almost nothing, asking whether hardness truly secures what it tries to protect, inviting the experiment of softness practiced long enough to become unanswerable. A last question ripples through the quiet. When stone is remembered centuries from now, will the memory be the crack or the curve the water left behind? And which of these tells the truer story of strength? Night settles more deeply, and the mind drifts with it, carrying the image of a river through darkness, silvered under moonlight, moving without hurry toward a destination unseen. Lao Tzu's image of water is not a metaphor invented for comfort, but an observation repeated through the centuries, a truth that belongs to the earth as much as to the text. Water is the master of adaptation. It takes the shape of the cup without argument, fills the hollow of the land without condition, and yet, over seasons and centuries, it sculpts entire continents. In the Tao Te Ching, it is written that nothing in the world is softer than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard. The paradox is real because it refuses the usual meaning of strength. In the human mind, strength is often imagined as dominance, the ability to force one's will upon others or upon circumstance. But water teaches that lasting influence comes not from domination, but from endurance, from the quiet persistence that outlives the momentary blaze of force. Watch the river in flood, and you see its temporary violence, but watch it in its ordinary state, and you see its true nature, patient, unceasing, willing to travel the long road rather than claim an immediate victory. To live as water lives is to accept that the world resists the straight line. Rocks will rise, banks will narrow, fallen branches will block the way, and the impatient will turn to frustration. But water turns to finding another path. It curves where it must curve. It pauses in pools where it must rest. It even retreats when the tide draws it back, trusting that it will return again. This is not resignation. It is the wisdom of knowing that the goal is not to win today, but to keep moving for as long as there is movement to make. The sage observing this learns to measure time not in days or hours, but in seasons and cycles. An insult received may be answered in silence, not from weakness, but because the answer is already being shaped by patience. A setback may be met with a change in direction rather than a collision with the obstacle. To be soft in this way is to place faith in transformation rather than in confrontation. The stone, after all, is unchanged after the first drop of rain, and perhaps even after 100, but in the length of years it is worn smooth, its edges rounded, its face carved. Water has no memory for revenge, but it remembers its purpose. In the same way, the mind that flows with the Tao does not hoard bitterness or pride, it holds to its direction and allows the rest to dissolve. And there is another layer to water's strength, its humility. It seeks the lowest places. It does not rush to the heights but flows down into the valleys, into the shadowed hollows where others will not go. In this humility, it gathers all the streams, uniting them into a greater whole. The sea, said Lao Tzu, is king of the 100 streams because it lies below them. This is not the humility of self-erasure, but the humility of inclusion, the kind that creates space for others to join without fear. Those who wish to lead without force can learn here, to lead like the sea, by receiving, by making room, by letting others flow toward you rather than pushing them from behind. There is a peace in this, and a power. One can see it in the way water reflects without holding, mirrors without judgment, carries without ownership. The sky may pass across it in clouds or in stars, and water holds both images in turn, never confusing them with itself. A person who can be like this, clear enough to reflect yet calm enough not to cling, becomes as untouchable as the river's heart, for they cannot be disturbed beyond the ripples that fade in their own time. It is easy to admire the torrent, the waterfall, the dramatic rush of water over a precipice, but Lao Tzu's teaching is to admire also the unseen work of water, the slow seep into stone, the hidden flow beneath the soil, the quiet accumulation of drops that will one day wear a channel through the hardest ground. In the long night, as the candle burns lower, this truth feels close. Strength is not the clenched jaw, the raised voice, the unyielding demand. Strength is the silent shaping, the slow approach, the resilience that does not announce itself, but is found still flowing when everything else has stopped. And so the river moves on, and so should the heart. The night deepens, and the quiet becomes a vast plain, unbroken, except for the steady pulse of thought moving like a hidden stream under the surface. The mind returns to Lao Tzu's image, that nothing is softer than water, and yet it conquers the unyielding. To feel this is to see the distinction between speed and duration, between the sharpness of a moment and the depth of a lifetime. A blade can cut once and then dull. A hammer can strike and then rest. But water moves without ceasing, and its ceaselessness is its edge. The Tao Te Ching does not speak of victory in the language of battles, but in the language of seasons. It trusts what is repeated over time more than what is imposed in an instant. The heart of this wisdom is patience, not the patience of waiting passively, but the patience of acting in alignment with the rhythms of the world, knowing that resistance consumes itself faster than endurance does. The river does not push the boulder head on, for that would only exhaust its force in a single, futile moment. Instead, it slides past, finding the spaces, wearing the edges, until the stone is no longer an obstacle, but part of the path. It is a truth both simple and difficult, to remain in motion without clinging to the need to arrive, to understand that the journey is not the means to an end, but the end itself unfolding in each bend, each ripple. To live like water is to accept the shape the moment offers without becoming trapped by it. When a vessel is narrow, water becomes narrow. When a basin is wide, water spreads without resistance. In human life, this is the art of adjusting without losing essence, of bending without breaking, of being shaped by circumstance, while still carrying forward the same quiet direction. Many fear that such yielding is a kind of defeat, but it is in truth the avoidance of unnecessary loss. For what is lost in rigidity cannot be regained, but what is preserved through flexibility may be used again and again. Water also teaches humility, the choice to seek the low ground, the willingness to go where others will not go, not because it lacks ambition, but because it understands that the low ground receives all streams. This is the humility of listening more than speaking, of absorbing rather than resisting, of learning without the armor of pride. In leadership, it is the humility that unites, for those who would be followed must first make space for others to come to them. Lao Tzu saw the sea as the great master, because it lies beneath the rivers, allowing them to flow into it freely. This is a leadership without force, a gathering of strength through reception rather than through demand. In relationships, the waterway is the choice to hold without gripping, to offer space without absence, to reflect without distortion. Water mirrors the sky without keeping its image. So too can one receive the words, the emotions, the presence of another without turning them into possessions. This is a rare kind of strength, for it cannot be taken by threat nor diminished by insult. And water's lesson is not only in movement, but in stillness. A river flows, yet there are moments when it pools into deep quiet, the surface smooth as glass, holding the world's image without a sound. Such stillness is not the absence of life, but its concentration, a readiness to move again when the time is right. In the same way, there are seasons in which the wise do not press forward, but rest, gather, and deepen. Stillness allows clarity to return. It lets the silt of confusion settle so the bottom can be seen again. In the rush to act, many lose their way, but in the pause, the next step often reveals itself without effort. Water also accepts transformation without fear. It becomes vapor in the sun's warmth, mist in the morning cool, ice in the mountain shadow, and returns again to liquid without clinging to any state as final. This is the great teaching for a human life, to change form when change is needed, without resisting the return to a previous form when the time calls for it. Nothing in water says permanence is the measure of truth. Instead, it says that continuity through change is the real constant. To follow this is to be free from the terror of endings, for every ending in water is only a movement to another place, another shape, another chance to flow. And so in the deep hours, the image of water remains, soft, patient, unbroken, not because it refuses to meet what is hard, but because it knows it has no need to struggle. The hard breaks itself, the soft simply endures, and in the end, it is endurance that shapes the world. The mind drifts further into the dim corridors of thought, where the sound of water becomes not only a sound, but a presence, a reminder that all things move toward transformation. Lao Tzu's vision of water is not simply a poetic device, but a framework for living, a method of aligning with the inevitable rather than opposing it. In his teaching, the soft conquers the hard because the soft refuses the single moment of victory. It plays instead for the endless game, where time is the true ally. Stone may resist for years, even centuries, but water's persistence is a promise that cannot be broken. The lesson moves quietly into the heart. One does not have to win today to shape tomorrow. This is the art of slow triumph, the patience that outlives resistance by outlasting it. And yet, water is not only patient, it is deliberate. Every curve of a river's path is the result of countless decisions, some swift, some subtle, made by its own flowing body as it meets the contours of the world. It does not argue with the cliff, it turns. It does not curse the fallen tree, it passes beneath. It does not resent the drought, it waits in the cool earth until the rains return. To live as water is to become untroubled by the need to control the form of the path, for the path is never truly fixed. The strength is in the movement itself, in refusing to become still out of fear of change. And in this refusal, there is a deeper truth, that surrender is not always loss, and control is not always gain. By yielding, water gains access to every space. By insisting on its shape, it would lose most. In the human spirit, this becomes the practice of entering situations with openness rather than rigidity, allowing oneself to be shaped by the experience without being consumed by it. Yet water's humility hides its immense capacity for power. It may begin as a trickle, gentle enough to pass unnoticed, but with time it gathers, it swells, it becomes a current that can sweep away what once seemed immovable. This is why the sage values the low ground. There, in the place where nothing seeks to stand tall, all things eventually meet. The low ground is the meeting point of rivers, the resting place of rain, the foundation upon which the mountains drain themselves. In human life, the low ground is found in listening, in observation, in the quiet taking in of what others offer without immediate need to respond or display. This gathering is not passive, it is preparation. For when the moment comes to act, one acts from abundance rather than emptiness. The sea is the king of streams because it lies beneath them, Lao Tzu writes. To lie beneath is to choose the position of reception rather than dominance, to let others come of their own will. This is the power of the one who does not chase but attracts, who does not demand loyalty but inspires it. And still, there is a gentleness that remains unbroken even in water's greatest force. The waves that batter the shore also carry life to it. The flood that reshapes the land leaves behind fertile soil. In the human soul, the equivalent is a firmness of principle that does not lose kindness, an ability to stand without cruelty. To be like water is to refuse the belief that one must harm to remain strong. There is also the teaching of reflection. Clear water mirrors the world without holding it, and in this, it teaches detachment. The sky's passing clouds, the moon's changing face, the faces of those who stand at the bank, all are held for a moment, then released. So should the mind hold its experiences, seen, known, and then allowed to pass without binding them to the self. This is not forgetfulness, but freedom from possession. And perhaps the most subtle teaching of water is its acceptance of cycles. It evaporates into the unseen sky, becomes cloud, returns as rain, gathers again into streams, never fearing that leaving its current form is the end. In human life, every loss is a change of form, every ending a return to another beginning. The sage does not cling to what must transform, for the same river is never the same river, yet it is always the river. The night grows deeper still, and the flow of thought becomes indistinguishable from the flow of water itself, quiet, steady, certain that it will continue long after the listener's eyes close and the dream begins. In the stillness of thought, water becomes not only an element, but a principle that reaches into the core of human conduct. Lao Tzu saw in its quiet endurance a truth that words often fail to hold. The world is not conquered by those who push hardest, but by those who cannot be pushed aside. The stone resists once, twice, perhaps 100 times, but resistance is finite. Endurance has no such limit. Water does not exhaust itself in the act of overcoming. It overcomes by continuing. And in that continuation lies a subtle form of wisdom, one that does not see victory as a single, shining moment, but as a quiet inevitability that unfolds without the noise of battle. This is why the sage learns to value time as a companion rather than an enemy. Time, like water, wears down all that is fixed and unbending, but it also nourishes all that is willing to grow. To be in harmony with time is to refuse the false urgency of forcing outcomes before they are ready. To understand that the ripest fruit will fall without effort, that the seed beneath the soil already knows its way upward. Yet water's teaching is not passivity. It moves, always moves, shaping the land, feeding the roots, carrying life from one place to another. Even when it appears still, there is movement beneath, currents invisible to the eye, but strong enough to shift the bed of the river. So it is with the inner life. The most profound transformations often occur in the depths, where no one is looking. To cultivate such depth is to live without needing the constant approval of the surface world, to find strength in the unseen work that will, in time, emerge naturally. In this, water teaches the discipline of self-containment. It does not boast of where it has been or where it will go. It simply flows toward its purpose. And purpose for water is not a fixed point but a state of being. The river does not dream of the sea, it moves toward it because that is what it is. In human terms, this is to act in accordance with one's nature, not in pursuit of an image or reward. When action is aligned with nature, there is no exhaustion from pretending, no weariness from holding a shape that is not one's own. Water's humility is another part of its strength. It does not seek the highest place but finds the lowest, not out of shame, but because the lowest place is the gathering place. There streams unite. There life thrives. Lao Tzu saw that a ruler who holds himself low becomes the meeting point for his people, and a person who lowers pride becomes a friend to all. Humility is not weakness but access. It is the opening through which all things may pass. In the way of water, pride is a dam, and humility the open channel. And water's patience is not without its moments of sudden transformation. There are times when a river swells into a flood, when the quiet accumulation becomes an unstoppable surge. In life, this is the moment when long preparation meets the right conditions, when years of quiet work produce a single, undeniable movement. The flood is not reckless, it is the release of what was already stored. And when the force is spent, water returns to stillness, without regret for its brief display of power. This is a strength rare in the world, knowing when to act with full force and when to return to the quiet flow. Water also teaches transparency. It holds no secrets for itself, yet it conceals depths to those who look without truly seeing. In its clarity, it reflects the world faithfully. In its depth, it holds mysteries. This is the balance the sage seeks: openness without vulnerability to harm, depth without the need for display. And perhaps the most comforting of water's lessons is its inevitability. It will reach the sea, whether in days or decades, whether as a river, a stream, or a cloud returning as rain. There is no doubt in its journey, only the calm certainty of arrival. For a human life, this is the trust that one's path, if walked with constancy, will arrive where it must, without the strain of forcing each step. The night listens to these truths as a sleeper listens to the rain, not needing to grasp each drop, only to feel the rhythm that has no beginning and no end. And in that rhythm, the soul finds its own reflection, soft, patient, enduring. There is an ancient scene, imagined yet true, in which Lao Tzu sits by the edge of a slow-moving stream, his robes gathered loosely, the air scented with pine, and the quiet sweetness of distant blossoms. He does not speak at first, for the water is already teaching, and he listens as one listens to an elder. The stream glides past, carrying leaves that turn in gentle spirals, their movements directed not by will, but by the unhurried certainty of the current. Here he observes what many fail to see. Water does not compete, yet nothing can rival its persistence. It does not shout, yet its voice is heard by mountains and valleys alike. It does not resist, yet its path cannot be stopped. This is not only poetry, it is instruction for the human spirit. Life often presses the mind to harden, to defend, to meet force with greater force. But Lao Tzu's water reveals that the greater mastery is in avoiding the trap of direct collision. When the path is blocked, water bends. When confined, it finds the smallest opening. When pressed downward, it gains momentum. When lifted to the sky, it waits until it can fall again. In this lies the art of transforming what is given into what is needed. The sage learns to make use of the obstacles, to see in each constraint the chance to move differently, to let the shape of the challenge guide the shape of the response. And yet, water's way is not an excuse for inaction. Its patience is active. It is a patience that never ceases to work. Even the smallest drip, allowed enough time, can pierce stone. Even the gentlest wave, given enough repetition, can alter the shape of the shore. This is a reminder that progress is not always visible in the moment, that the most enduring changes are often invisible until they are complete. The heart that adopts water's pace learns not to demand immediate results, for it understands that the present moment is only a fragment of the whole journey. The mind too can be like a river, clear when it allows thought to flow freely, muddy when it clings to what it should release. When the mind is clear, it reflects truth without distortion, like still water beneath a moonlit sky. When agitated, it loses its depth, and even the brightest light cannot be seen within it. Thus, to live like water is to cultivate a calm within, not as a withdrawal from life, but as a condition for engaging with it fully. This calm is not broken by passing storms, for storms too are part of the great cycle. They churn the surface but cannot reach the deep currents below. Lao Tzu's teachings suggest that the soul should live in those deeper currents, steady and untroubled, letting the surface do as it must. There is also a quiet nobility in the way water nourishes without seeking recognition. It gives itself to roots and seeds without claiming ownership of the growth. It refreshes the weary without asking for thanks. In this, water becomes a model for generosity, offering without expectation, aiding without claiming credit. True virtue, in Lao Tzu's vision, is like this: unseen, unrecorded, yet essential to all life. And still, the paradox remains that water's gentleness is the very source of its strength. The sword is proud of its sharpness, but it dulls. The rock boasts of its weight, but it crumbles. The fire burns brightly, but it consumes itself. Water endures because it does not insist on being what it is not. It does not oppose the truth of its own nature. In this, there is a profound invitation to self-acceptance, to live in a way that does not fight one's essence, to be shaped without losing the core of who one is. And perhaps most profound of all is water's lesson of return. No matter how far it travels, it is always on its way back to the sea, its vast home where all rivers meet. In the same way, the human spirit, through countless changes of form and place, moves toward its own vastness, its own unbroken source. There is comfort in knowing that no detour is wasted, no delay permanent. All that moves with sincerity arrives. And so the night holds this thought as the stream outside continues its endless journey, whispering to the stones, to the trees, to the one who listens in stillness, that the way forward is not in force, but in flow, not in holding on, but in letting go, not in speed, but in the certainty of return. In the quiet reach of night, the image of water deepens into a mirror for the human soul, showing that softness is not the absence of power, but its most enduring form. Lao Tzu understood this in a way that was more than metaphor. He saw it in the valleys where rivers had carved their way through ancient stone, in the delicate persistence of rain that, drop by drop, reshaped the face of the earth. The lesson was clear. What yields can also prevail. What bends can outlast what refuses to move. This truth unsettles the mind, trained to think in terms of dominance, of winning by strength alone, for it suggests that victory can be silent, almost invisible, and still absolute. The sage sees in this not a contradiction, but a deeper harmony, a reminder that power and gentleness are not enemies. To live like water is to resist the temptation to meet every challenge with direct opposition. It is to understand that the straightest line is not always the best path, that sometimes the way forward is found by flowing around the obstacle rather than breaking it apart. Water knows no impatience. It does not rush to overcome, nor does it despair when blocked. Instead, it trusts the quiet mathematics of time, the slow inevitability of its nature. And time for water is not an adversary, but a companion. In human life, this translates to an acceptance that not all things can or should be forced into the present moment, that some transformations can only be completed through the unhurried accumulation of days and seasons. Yet water is never still in its essence. Even in the calmest pool, there are movements too subtle for the eye to catch. Tiny currents shifting, life sustained below the surface. This hidden activity is a reminder that patience is not idleness, that stillness can contain its own quiet work. For the one who listens, this suggests a way of living in which effort is steady and continuous, but never frantic, where change is pursued without the strain of desperation. Water also teaches humility by seeking the lowest places, not out of shame, but because these are the gathering places, the points where streams unite. Lao Tzu knew that a person who can dwell in humility becomes a point of connection, a meeting ground for others, a source of nourishment and support. Pride stands apart and alone. Humility gathers and multiplies. In this way, lowering oneself becomes a form of strength, a way of holding more rather than less. And water's humility is not weakness, for it can rise as vapor, move with the wind, fall again as rain. It is always willing to change its form, to adapt without losing its essence. In human terms, this is the courage to let go of rigid identities, to allow oneself to be shaped by circumstances without being broken by them. Such adaptability is not a betrayal of self, but a return to the core of one's nature. For just as water is water, whether in river, cloud or snow, a person remains themselves through all transformations if they remain true to their essence. Water also holds the lesson of clarity. A clear stream reflects the sky perfectly, but when stirred by violence, it becomes opaque, its depths hidden. So too the mind, which can only reflect truth when it is calm. Anger, fear, and agitation cloud it, making even the simplest truths difficult to see. To live like water is to cultivate a mind that clears quickly, that allows disturbances to pass through without clinging to them. Such clarity is not constant perfection, it is the ability to return to transparency again and again. And in the moments when water swells into flood, when its force is suddenly visible and irresistible, it shows that gentleness does not mean weakness, that patience does not mean passivity. When the conditions are right, when the moment has ripened, water moves with unstoppable force, sweeping away what was thought immovable. The wise person too knows when to act decisively after long preparation, when to let stored potential become a single, transformative act. Yet when the surge is over, water returns to its quiet flow, without clinging to its moment of power, without seeking to preserve it. This is the rhythm of life well lived, times of stillness, times of movement, each with their place, each flowing naturally into the other. And so in the dim candlelight, the lesson of water becomes more than words. It becomes a presence, a way of breathing and being. It asks nothing, demands nothing, only invites the listener to soften, to endure, to flow, to trust that the path will lead where it must, not through force, but through the inevitability of what cannot be stopped. In this, the heart begins to understand what the mountains have always known, that even the hardest stone must one day bow to the gentlest touch, repeated without end. The moon hangs low over the still surface of a hidden lake, silver lights scattered across the ripples where a breeze has touched the water and moved on. In this quiet, Lao Tzu's thought takes shape, not as a rigid doctrine, but as something living, flowing, breathing. Water is his teacher, his metaphor, his mirror. In its patience, he sees the futility of haste. In its humility, he sees the power of yielding. And in its unbroken persistence, he sees the inevitability of transformation. The mountains believe themselves eternal, yet the streams carve their faces with patient hands. The walls built by human ambition crumble where rain seeps into their smallest cracks. Time favours the gentle, not because it is sentimental, but because gentleness works in harmony with its long cycles, never exhausting itself in the illusion of control. A person who understands this no longer measures progress in sudden victories, but in the subtle shifts that unfold quietly and without announcement. Water teaches that one need not always push forward. Sometimes it is wiser to wait, to let the terrain reveal its openings, to let gravity do the work. And yet this waiting is not the waiting of passivity. It is the waiting of a seed before spring, alive with hidden growth. Even the softest drop wears away the stone, not by force but by returning, again and again, unchanged in its intent. Lao Tzu saw that a life lived in such a way becomes unshakable. No insult can wound it deeply, for it flows past. No obstacle can hold it forever, for it finds another way. No loss can destroy it, for it knows the sea awaits at the end of every journey. This way of being is neither resistance nor surrender, but a deeper synthesis where one chooses the form of surrender that becomes its own kind of resistance. In the stillness of water, there is also a lesson about reflection. When undisturbed, it reveals what stands above it with perfect clarity. The human mind too is capable of such clarity, but only when it is allowed to settle, when the storms of emotion have been given time to pass. Clarity cannot be forced, it arrives naturally when the agitation is released. To see truly, one must learn to let the sediment of thought sink to the depths until the surface shines like a mirror. And yet water is not afraid to be stirred, for it knows the sediment will settle again. There is no fear of change in its nature, no desperate clinging to form. A river is not less itself when it becomes mist, nor when the mist becomes rain. The essence remains even as the shape shifts. This is the freedom that comes from self-knowledge, the understanding that identity is not bound to one moment, one role, one appearance. When the mind adopts this fluidity, life's transitions no longer appear as threats but as natural phases of the same unbroken current. In its giving, water teaches a final quiet truth. It nourishes without discrimination, flowing equally to the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the decayed. It asks for nothing in return. This is the highest form of generosity, one that gives not because of obligation or desire for recognition, but because giving is simply its way of being. A life shaped in this image finds its own fulfillment in the act itself, not in the reward. The candle on the low table flickers as a breath of night air slips into the room, and the listener can almost hear the voice of that ancient sage, not as a command, but as a suggestion. Be like water. Let strength be hidden within gentleness. Let movement be guided by the path that opens before you. Let your persistence be so natural that even you forget you're enduring. When the world becomes hard and unyielding, do not try to match it blow for blow. Flow into the spaces it leaves unguarded. And when joy or sorrow rise suddenly like a flood, let them pass without grasping. Return to your calm channel, to the deep and steady current that cannot be seen from the surface. In this way, the heart learns not only to survive but to prevail, not by winning but by outlasting, not by dominating but by transforming. For in the end, all things return to the sea, and the sea waits for nothing yet receives everything.